Hey developers, today we're going to look at a web development guide for the year 2020. We're going to look at all the things that are modern day web development that you guys should know. We're going to look at some trends I see happening in the future, and we're going to define a lot of different terms. So make sure you stay all the way to the end and learn all about it. Hey, and if you don't know, my name is Eric. I'm a full stack software developer. I'm also an author of a few books. This channel is all about web development, Vue.js, React, Angular, and things that you should know to become a better web developer. So if you like that type of content, make sure you click that subscribe button. But without further ado, let's just jump in and talk about it. Okay, so let's take a look at some trends, some things that you should be knowing in 2020 as a web developer. So the way I'm gonna work this is we're gonna go pretty broad. We're gonna talk about a lot of different technologies, and I'm not gonna go in depth into a lot of them, but I think this is a great way to introduce a lot of you guys to these different technologies, things that you should probably know if you are already a web developer, or things that you may want to look into as the future. Obviously, it's almost impossible for us to know everything, so maybe you could take one of these areas and specialize in it. So let's begin here. So here is what we're going to go over for my web development guide for 2020. So we're going to start off with the basics. So language agnostic principles that you should be familiar with. So how do you write good software? And there's been many books, there's many people that have talked about this throughout the years since development has began. So let's take a look at what these resources are, a couple of principles and ideas that you guys should be aware of. And I think that definitely should be the starting point for if you're wanting to become a developer, or if you're already a developer and you're looking to get a little bit better, is just to know some of these basics, some of these principles. Now you have to gauge which ones you want to take. Obviously there's a lot of information and advice out there. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. I'm going to talk about some of the ones I like and I think you guys should follow and think you guys should know. Then we're going to look at JavaScript. Obviously this channel is all about JavaScript and frameworks, so I think it's important to talk about JavaScript and some key ideas and things you should know. Then we're going to look at CSS. CSS is extremely important. So you should be able to take any sort of design that you're given and convert it into CSS and HTML. And so we're going to talk about what you should know for CSS in 2020. And then HTML structures are apt together. It's still extremely important. Let's take a look at it. Then we're going to deep dive into frameworks. So I think any sort of job out there, you're going to look at some sort of framework of some kind, and they are really important. So you need to know what frameworks you should be looking at, what frameworks you probably shouldn't be looking at, and then what tools you should use with those. So we'll talk about that, and I'll also include / libraries with that, and we'll get to that in a bit. Then we're going to look at DevOps. Now these next 5 things we're going to look at are not specifically related to the front end, but we're going to kind of deep dive into the whole software development lifecycle, from the point of we have an idea, we're working in the front end, but how does modern software development work nowadays? What technologies are used, and how does it get into production so everyday people can use it? So obviously an important part of that is DevOps. So how does that work? We're going to kind of talk about some key ideas and integration and deployment. Then we're going to look at cloud, and cloud is kind of a broad term, but we understand that we are delivering software, but what are these services that are out there that are becoming really popular and that you probably should know in 2020, even if you're just in the front end or if you're in the back end. So we're going to talk about some of the services available. And then I wasn't sure where to put this, but I'm going to put command line right in the middle, because it's really important to know how to use the command line. What are some common command line utils that you should be using, what you should be using every day, where can you find more information, things like that. Then we're going to deep dive, we're going to talk about some of the common back-end technologies out there that modern web development uses. So we're going to talk about those languages briefly. We're not going to go into too much detail because I'm just ran out of time. There's so much stuff we want to talk about today. But you should at least know these are out there and they're great career paths for you. In fact, I think most modern developers, especially us who call ourselves web developers, also call ourselves full stack. So the full stack part of that is you need to know the back end, and so you want to pick a language in the back end. And so we're going to talk about what's available out there. And then we're going to go to other. So these are some other tools that I didn't mention that didn't really fit in these other areas. I think I probably could have made this 100 slides. So I just kind of wanted to focus on some major areas. If you find an area I didn't talk about in here, which I'm sure I have, I've missed quite a few smaller details, smaller technologies, leave a comment below. Let me know what you are using today and what things that you think that a web developer should know in 2020. And then we're also, and I didn't put this on the slide here, but we're going to look at some 3 or 4 future technologies that I want to keep in the back of our heads. And these are also great career paths. Most of them are here today, but they're good things to learn in 2020 if you haven't looked at already. So let's continue on. Okay. So what I'm going to do, these slides are all going to kind of be based on 3 things at a time. I don't want to give you guys, overload you with information, so we're going to keep at a pretty high level. So when I talk about beyond the basics is that when you start working in web development, you really want to look at not just the highest layer, but you want to kind of understand how we got to where we are today. And doesn't mean you have to be an expert, but it means you probably should know things like patterns, like design patterns. What is a model view controller? What is a factory pattern? What's a singleton? Some of these things are used every day, and you may not even know they have a name, but you're using those patterns, and I think those are extremely important. There's clean code principles, like solid, like the open-close principle, dependency inversion, dependency injection. Understand what those are. And then best practices and terms. I think the most common one I hear all the time is dry. Don't repeat yourself. You want your code to be readable. And you want to have it so if another developer reads it, it makes sense instead of using all these tricks so that way you can make smaller code. There's this whole paradigm of thinking of your code in either object-oriented programming, but there's also versus functional programming and then procedural programming that you might be doing today. So understand the differences between the 3, and you can really deep dive into any 3 of those and understand different patterns. Like if you're using object-oriented programming, like if you're in an Angular stack, you might think of something like interfaces. How do those work? How do abstract classes work? So you want to look at that. Functional programming, you might be looking at maps. How do you not mutate data? So there's a lot of different principles here. And so I think if you're starting off with, if you know a little bit about web development, start looking at some of these ideas before you write your first line of software. Some resources to do that. Here's a book list. Many people before have talked about these subjects. I like The Pragmatic Programmer, Code Complete 2, Design Patterns. That's really old. It's Grady Booch. There used to be something called the Gang of Four who created this way of thinking of creating software where we're putting everything into patterns that can be commonly reused throughout your app. There's the idea of clean architecture and clean code where we kind of go back to the solid principles. And then, you can even go back and look at, there's a lot of really great blogs out there. One of the creators of Stack Overflow, Joel Spolsky, has a blog, and he has so much amazing articles about how he hires people, how he creates code, how he thinks about those things. So even looking back at those will be helpful. Now, as a brand new developer and you don't know anything, some of these might be pretty high level for you, but I think things like Pragmatic Programmer would be something that even a new developer can jump in and understand the way you want to create software. So these are some great books I would look into. But let's say you know those, you understand some of those concepts, you want to jump into the code. So I think in 2020, JavaScript is still king. So we want to kind of look at, if you're jumping to JavaScript, functions, scope, control flow, loops, if else, how you do error handling. So how you do promises, how you return back promises if they reject or fail. If you're using the class syntax, object-oriented programming. If you're using more functional programming, ES6 and the new stuff coming out. I think it's ES 2019. There's all these new things coming out. The JavaScript, ECMAScript world out there is changing. And so you want to know how to use these new things that are coming into the language as they become popular, like, arrow functions, that's became popular a few years ago. And then TypeScript and There's Elm and there's ClojureScript. I'm a big fan of TypeScript. It's a superset of JavaScript. Nice thing about it is you put it in your Visual Code, you get types, you get type IntelliSense, so you can find errors before they occur. It just becomes really a better way of creating apps, and I'm a big fan of TypeScript. So I'm kind of going over these terms pretty quickly. Feel free to pause the video, write them down, Google them later on if any of these terms are not making sense to you. But these are things you kind of want to learn in 2020. And like I said, we're going to go over a lot of things. We're not going to go super deep, but things you should know. Libraries. So the amount of JavaScript libraries are ever increasing. These are the ones you probably should know. In fact, there was just a survey, 2019 State of JavaScript survey, and they talked about some of the most popular libraries. And these were them: Lodash, Moment, jQuery, still some of the most popular ones. Lodash is like a utilities library where you can do a lot of common utilities inside your JavaScript with Lodash. Moment's is great with dates. jQuery is more of I guess you could call it a framework. It has a lot of different things. Now, I did talk in the past about not using jQuery, so take my word that you probably at least want to know about it. There's still tons of companies that use jQuery, so it's probably a good thing. And then there's a little bit of higher level libraries like Redux. There's these Flux type patterns where you're dealing with data and how you save them. There's also RxJS, which is a way that you can stream data, and it has all these utility functions. So keep in mind of these type of libraries. So CSS. Let's go back to CSS. So I think there's I always see these two type of developers that get into web development. There's the developers that were way into design or animation, and then they got into web development and they're like, wow, this is cool. Now I can make cool programs and apps, and I can design them the way I want to design them because I'm going to use CSS. And then I see the other side, which are people that come from more of a programming background or analytical background. They don't like the design at all, but they like putting pieces of a puzzle together. And either way is fine. But I think for web development, you definitely want to learn CSS, understand how you use all the different CSS selectors, understand the box model. CSS specificity is really important. There's a lot of CSS attributes that you should learn. Learning how to lay out using Flexbox or Grid, how to lay out your app. Grid is not available in older browsers, like if you're using IE9 or really old, but it's still pretty well supported right now, and it's something that I think everyone should learn. And then once you learn those, you look at CSS preprocessors. So we're talking about Sass and Stylus and Less. I think Sass is probably the most popular out of all of them, but it's easier to write your CSS. They give you extra tools. It basically processes your CSS and converts it from Sass to CSS. So it kind of uses this preprocessor to do it. And then you can get cool things like you can create mix-ins of your Sass, and you can really try things that you couldn't normally do with just plain CSS. So it gives you some extra options, and I think a lot of developers have moved that way. So let's not forget that with CSS, we're doing a design, and having a little bit of design background is important for those people, especially those people coming from design. This is natural to them. But looking at typography, like what looks good on the screen on different font sizes, what conveys different messages, and that can really be important for typography. Animations, you can do transitions and keyframes, and there's a lot of really cool things you can do to make your web app pop. I always say, though, I'm not a huge fan of animations unless you're really trying to make a really cool app that really pops. But most of the time, some animations can get a little annoying. So there's always, you gotta weigh the good and the bad there. Spacing between the letters, spacing between lines, those are all really important. The readability, how many words you have on a line can determine how readable it is for the user. Using different colors and understanding that accessibility is really important. I could do a whole slide deck on different accessibilities between writing good HTML, semantic HTML, how screen readers use your app. So keeping accessibility in mind, using the ARIA attributes is really, for example, using the ARIA attributes is really important. So code editors. So in 2020, really Visual Studio Code is probably the number one, especially for web developers out there. But don't think that's the only one out there. Atom's really popular. So is Sublime, Notepad++, brackets, WebStorm. I knew back in the day people just used to write web. A lot of hardcore developers used to write everything in Notepad. Of course, Notepad++ has some really neat plugins. There's a lot of really good Visual Studio Code extensions that make it really nice as well. I didn't put on here, but Vim and Emacs. Vim was traditionally just a text editor, but with the right plugins, you can have it be your integrated development environment. I put editor here, but I guess it's really environment, integrated development environment, or editor. Okay, so HTML tags. So there is tons of HTML tags, but they basically help structure the presentation of your app. So 2020, you definitely need to learn this. How to write semantic HTML. And what I mean by that is your HTML should convey the meaning of your content. So you've probably seen these pages where it's just div after div and embedded div after div, and those are okay in some circumstances. But if you really want to write clean semantic HTML, you're looking at some of the things that are in HTML, like you have sections and you have section tags and you have footers and you have headers. And if you can structure your web page in such a way, it just makes more sense. And it's great for web crawlers and accessibility and things like that. But there's also ways to write your HTML using preprocessors. And so there's Haml, there's Pug. Basically, you can do a bunch of different shorthands in your HTML to make it much quicker to write. There's also plugins like Emmet and VS Code that you can just tab and then it just auto-completes things. That's different. There's this mustache syntax where you have double brackets. I know that both Vue and Angular have similar syntax, a template syntax that uses that mustache type syntax. So understanding these preprocessors can make you that much better. And it also depends on your coding environment and what you set up when the project was initially created. Okay, web browsers. I think we all know about Chrome and Firefox and Safari. Those are the three probably the most popular web browsers out today. But don't forget there's a lot of different Android and iOS mobile browsers out there that you probably should test. There's a bunch of different testing services which you can use to test your code on different browsers. There's also IE11 still alive, and Edge is probably gaining popularity too. So on the Microsoft side, there's even Opera. There's a great website called Can I Use where you can see what kind of compatibility you'll have if you use different HTML or CSS in these older browsers. And of course, and I could do a whole slide deck on this, is understanding the development tools that these different browsers give you. So Chrome has a really great way you can inspect your code, and it has a really great dev tools. So does Firefox. Even Firefox has some features that are a little bit better than Chrome in some ways, especially with grid, if you want to look at the grid layout. But Safari is nice too. So you just keep in mind there's different web browsers, and you should know how to use them. You should download them if you're becoming a web developer and learn how to use them. Frameworks. So this is probably what you guys hear from me. I talk a lot about. So I think really this year, and this was really solidified by the State of JavaScript 2019 survey that just came out. These are the three most popular frameworks. Vue, which is called the Progressive JavaScript Framework, which I think is one of the simplest and easiest to start out with if you're looking to jump into JavaScript and frameworks. React is probably definitely the most popular out there. It's probably the most jobs out there. It's technically a library, and before you guys comment in here and say I'm calling it a framework, I understand it's a library, but once you add in the routing and Redux and a bunch of other things, and you're using React CLI, I feel like it's more of a framework at that point. And then Angular is probably in third place. I'm a big fan of Angular 2+. When I talk about Angular, that's what I'm talking about, and that is just a great framework of creating apps. It has so many things built into it. It has built on TypeScript. So TypeScript's out of the box, uses RxJS, has really robust forms built into it. And then I would say Svelte and Ember.js are some of the other JavaScript frameworks that are becoming more and more popular. Ember.js has been around forever. I'm a big fan of it still. And I think Svelte is gaining a lot of popularity too. And by the way, Ember.js just came out with a new version, the Octane edition, which really simplifies the way you write Ember apps. I should do a video on that. And then Vue has Vue 3 coming out soon, and it's adding in some things that React had, like a kind of a hooks for Vue and a few other things. So all these libraries and frameworks are stealing from each other. They're all great to learn. Let's not forget that WordPress is still happening. It's still extremely popular. I just Googled this. It said, according to some reports, it powers 35% of all websites. It's written in PHP, so PHP is not a dead language by any stretch of the imagination. There's many amazing Laravel projects. PHP's integrated in with WordPress. It's extremely, and one thing really nice about it is extremely easy to use for non-developers. So we as developers think, well, we create something, we put it out there, we get contacted every time we need to do updates. But there's so many marketing people, there's so many project managers and owners who want to make a quick tweak to something, and they don't want to have to talk to development, who have to get a ticket in to the ticketing system and has to go through DevOps. But WordPress, you can simply make easy changes. You don't have to be a developer, and that's why people love it. It also has a really robust plugin system. So it's definitely something to keep an eye out in 2020. DevOps. So DevOps is interesting because I think as a web developer, we really should understand what the pipeline is from our code, from the time we write it to the time it gets into production. So things like looking at continuous integration and continuous delivery, like the practice of quickly integrating new developed code with the main body of code that's to be released, and with delivery including automated testing. So really our ideas should be, when we write code, it should be tested. It should have automated tests hit it. It should be able to be integrated in every time something changes. It should be integrated in, and then we should be let know if we broke the build, because usually how a modern web development stack works is that your code is continuously being built every time you make changes, and you use a version control system, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then there's this idea of maybe even doing continuous deployment. Maybe this is a pie in the sky, but one day maybe you have enough automated tests in place where you can deploy to production without any human intervention. In fact, I talked about this in a podcast a while back on my Self-Taught or Not podcast, if you want to check it out, where I think this CI/CD, you can get to the point where you are doing a version of CI/CD that still has some manual intervention, but you're continuously integrating and you're continuously deploying to production on a very quick schedule. And it's not set based on sprints and things like that, which we'll talk about in a minute, which kind of ends up with Agile closely aligned. So there's this Agile methodology in software development, and it kind of goes right into DevOps. And it's really good to know because as a software developer, you're going to probably be on an Agile team, and you're going to have to be doing things that are aligned with Agile. And DevOps is aligned with that because part of Agile is continuously improving things, and that requires continuous integration. So let's talk about Agile. I'm going to give you a really high-level overview of what you should know in 2020. So, like, for example, the Agile Manifesto was brought together years ago. People got together, and they came up with these ideas, and a lot of things have come out of this. So it's individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. I like this part a lot because we want to take what we get from customers, and we want to have that drive where we're going over contract negotiation. So there's these different methods of doing software development. Back in the day, there was the waterfall method where you have these strict requirements that get sent to developers. Developers have everything. They define the requirements, they create it, it gets shipped off, it's tested, it gets into production. Well, in this case with Agile, we want to be lowercase Agile. We want to be able to talk to customers, make changes to the requirements based on what they want, and we want these smaller changes, responding to changes over following plan. So we have sprints that are very quick and small, maybe 1 week, 2 weeks in time frame, where we can finish what we need to do in those 2 weeks and then make changes based on the customer feedback and how that sprint goes. So you might hear terms like Scrum. We have these Scrum or these daily stand-ups. We use Kanban boards. There's like tons of software that does it, like Jira is pretty popular. You might use to do Kanban boarding. And then you have these sprints, which are short iterations. So Agile, is something you should know in 2020. And in many years, it's been available for many years. Testing. So testing your code is extremely important. Now, there's different ways you can test your code, and this also involves your QA department if you have one. So if you have a quality assurance department, they may be responsible for doing some of these tests as well. But there's modern tools like Jest, Mocha, like React test utils, Vue test utils. Cypress is an end-to-end test runner that you should be familiar with. So when you write code, that you can make sure that you're testing what you're actually coding for. And you should also have it be in such a way that you're not testing implementation details, but you're kind of testing a little bit higher level to make sure that the user interaction works right. So there's terms you probably should understand, like end-to-end testing, unit testing, integration testing, smoke testing, regression testing. Regression testing being extremely important, where you run your tests at the end of your code cycle or after you're done coding, just to make sure you didn't break anything in the past. Like I said, this is also integrated really well into the CI/CD pipeline. A lot of these tests should be run every time you make a build. Let's talk about cloud. So cloud computing is been around for a while, and I think it's really hitting its zenith in the last few years. So some of the most popular cloud providers are AWS or Amazon Web Services, the Google Cloud Platform, it's also called GCP, but there's tons of others. I think Microsoft Azure is probably the third place, but there's Netlify, Zeit. There's a whole bunch of other companies that are getting into this space and making it easy to provision your servers, to use serverless, to containerize or Dockerize, make Docker images of everything you're doing, and that really ties in with the DevOps. So working in the cloud, the slide's a little bit big, but like serverless is really important. So how do you write your code in such a way, especially if you're writing back-end code, not as much in the front end, but that can be just put into dynamically allocated there. It can sit somewhere where it doesn't do anything until it gets a request, and then it starts up, it does whatever it needs to do, sends it out. It's serverless, and it just does what it needs to do. So there's this also idea of, and by the way, this dynamically allocated, it's not like you have this one server doing it all. So there's infrastructure code is really important too. So the idea of making so you can take your whole environment, it's all written in code, and you can deploy it anywhere at any time on demand. And you can use tools like Terraform, CloudFormation, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, to name a few. And then, the containerization of our code. Now, this is getting pretty deep. If you're a web developer, you're like, do I really need to know this? But maybe this piques your interest. This could be a way of having your career in development, is looking at this world, because it's definitely a full-time job doing this. So using Docker, Kubernetes, to orchestrate several different Docker containers and how you deal with that. I like command line because the funny thing is, I've heard this happen, I've only heard of it, where you get this new developer and they're really excited, and then you ask them, okay, open up a command line, and they just don't know how to do anything. Like, oh, command line, maybe I know how to do Git, but I don't know how to change directories. I think it's really important if in this modern world to learn a little bit of the command line. Learn the basics, changing directories, listing, how do you cat a file, how do you remove a file, how do you make a directory, using some popular tools like Git, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then if you want to be even higher level, I'd look at command line shells like Bash or Zish or Fish, where you can usually, like if you're in a Mac environment, you have Bash, or if you're running Ubuntu or a Linux environment. But you can change your command line shell, and it has some really nice features available for it, and it has plugins to make it so you don't have to type out Git every time, or you can hit tab and it auto-completes different commands. So like SSH would also be another basic command, by the way, you should learn that I just thought of. And then text editors, I kind of briefly mentioned this before. You might hear people talk about Vim or Emacs or Nano. So I'm a big fan of Vim. I use Vim key bindings in my Visual Studio Code. I also used Vim for years in my last job. And learning Vim is important. I think the idea behind command line, learning these command line, learning these text editors is because it can make you faster. And one thing that's really important in development is to be smart and to get things done fast and quickly and with very little bugs and making good code. So being fast and learning these tools will help you out. And this goes into version control. I think this deserves its whole slide because it's something everybody's going to deal with. There's different version control systems. I happen to like Git, but there's SVN, there's Perforce, there's a few others. Helix, I think, is one of them. So you have to understand how to commit your code to repository, how to roll back your code, and how to use that correctly. And there's so many services out there too that do this. So I like GitHub, but I know some people that swear by GitLab, Bitbucket. There's a bunch of them. And some of them support not just Git, but also SVN, Perforce, things like that. I think scripting is something that often gets forgotten when you're learning web development. But being able to jump to the command line and then write simple scripts that can do things to make your life easier is important. I mean, I've gone into my my RC file, which is a file that I can add commands to add aliases to make things a little bit faster. I've scripted out things and used the cron job to do some scripting. So it's definitely feels more like a server side, but it's nice to at least understand the basics of scripting. And if you're ever working with a legacy system, you're probably going to have some old scripts that you'll need to understand. I've worked with old Java systems that had huge scripts that call different ant and maven commands, and it's good to understand it all. So we're going to briefly touch the back end. I wish I could get more time to talk about this, but going back again to the JavaScript server that just came out, Node is probably one of the most favorite programming languages, and they have frameworks for it like Express or Koa, which give you web development, a web framework for Node, I should say, and it's based on the V8 engine. So you're writing essentially JavaScript, and I think a lot of developers like this because if you're writing JavaScript on the front end, it's really nice to be able to write it on the back end. But don't forget that Ruby and Ruby on Rails is kind of the framework, the web framework for Ruby, is extremely powerful. There's so many gems. I know Node has NPM, which you can install libraries. Ruby has gems that you can install, and they give you like more functionality, more libraries to use that are pre-packaged up. There's just so many great things about Ruby on Rails. I used to write it a while back. I am pretty rusty at it now, but I was really impressed when I did write it. And I think Python would probably be the third most popular, and Django being that kind of web framework for Python. But don't forget, there's tons of enterprise sites that are using .NET, which includes C# and Java. And Java is huge upon itself. There's so many different frameworks and libraries. I can go on and on about that. I did a lot of Java work back at my job now and jobs in the past too. And then some other things to keep in mind. So when you're writing code, a lot of the code you're going to be writing as a front-end developer, on top of just creating the sites, the HTML, CSS, and design, which, by the way, hopefully you have a designer that can help you with the design. Sometimes those roles are separate, sometimes they're together. But you're going to be talking to a back-end service, so to understand how to talk to it, what a REST service is, what a GraphQL service is, or heaven forbid, you have to talk to a SOAP endpoint. SOAP is pretty old. You probably won't have to worry about that. But understanding those three is really important, especially GraphQL. It's becoming more popular. And just talking to a REST service. How to handle errors. If that REST service returns an error, what should you do? And how do you handle it? And then as you're using a lot more tools, and especially if you're using frameworks, you'll notice that sometimes there's things it won't do that you need to do. So you might have to jump into Webpack or Gulp or Browserify. So you have to look at these different tools that bundle your app together. And then this is kind of redundant, but GraphQL versus REST, how to talk to a backend. Okay, so let's talk about some future technologies that we should know. So I like this term, so I'm going to kind of encompass this JAMSTACK with a few different things. It's basically a way of building websites with better performance. If you look up JAMSTACK in one of the official websites, but it's basically JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So your APIs drive what's listed in your app. So there's things like Contentful and ThinkCentry. Well, let me think. There's a handful of API backends that hold data that you can then talk to help populate and create your site. And a lot of times these are static sites, meaning that let's say you write your app in React, but you're using something like Gatsby, which will render the app into static files. So you have all these .html files in different directories, and then it grabs the information from a server using the API, and it populates the HTML files. And what that does, it makes it super, super quick. So instead of having a Vue app or a React app, which is completely rendered in the client, and it kind of gets loaded that way, we're having a really quick response where the site is created statically and it's really quick. So like Jekyll, you can create static sites, so you can do Next or Nuxt, and of course Gatsby and GridSum I didn't even mention. So I think this is a kind of an interesting way of creating sites with static sites and using this JAMSTACK way of thinking. And usually use a lot of different services too. And emphasis on performance. So machine learning, so it's basically the study of statistical models and data using algorithms. It's kind of an up-and-coming field. It's definitely been popular in the last 5 years. So we can take lots of data, and what we find in a lot of industries, there's just thousands of gigs and terabytes of data, but can we understand how that data, can we predict the future from that data, is really interesting. So usually I've seen a lot of Python tools that do this, but we have TensorFlow, NumPy, Torch. I think you can even get TensorFlow, a JavaScript library, to do these things. So it's a great kind of future thing in a modern, in something you should probably think about. It's definitely happening today. There's a lot of machine learning jobs out there, but I would look into that. No code tools. So no code is designing web apps without having to know how to code. And as a developer, you're probably thinking, well, why do I need to know this? But I think this trend is going to continue, where people are going to look at how can we have our designer, how can we have our project manager, how can we have someone in the company other than the coder build something for us. And so there's tons of tools like Webflow, even Shopify has a sort of a website builder built in, Echo, Card, where you can create whole apps without having developers at all. In fact, there's a lot of entrepreneurship in this space where people are creating whole apps and not having to hire developers. And I think it's good to know as a developer what these tools are doing and how it's shaping up. There's also design tools like Stencil and Sprout Social as well. So look at the no-code tools in the future. I think this category is going to get bigger and bigger, and it will be supplementing what we have today. So thanks. So leave a comment below. Let me know if you agree, disagree on anything I talked about today. That was a lot of information, but I'm glad we got through it. I really appreciate you guys listening all the way to the end, watching all the way to the end. If you like these type of videos, make sure you share this with your friends, share it on social media. More people that can see it, that would be great. Thanks.